A routine college visit takes a shocking turn when an admissions officer dismisses a black student's application without a second glance. But what happens when someone in power discovers the truth? Let us know in the comments section below. Kayla Taylor's fingers clenched the strap of her backpack as she stood in the middle of the admissions office. The waiting area smelled like old books and freshly printed brochures, the air crisp with the artificial chill of an overpowered air conditioner. Students and parents sat in stiff chairs, whispering anxiously about their chances, their futures hanging in the balance of a single decision. None of them looked like her. Her heartbeat thrummed in her ears as she stepped toward the front desk. The woman behind it, a middle-aged receptionist with square glasses and a name tag that read Marjorie, barely looked up from her computer. "Excuse me," Kayla said, her voice steady but polite. "I'm here to drop off my application." Marjorie gave her a glance, her expression unreadable. "You can leave it there," she said, nodding toward a stack of papers. Kayla hesitated. "Actually, I was told I could speak to an admissions officer directly, just for a moment." That got Marjorie's full attention. Her gaze flicked up and down, scanning Kayla's hoodie, her neatly pressed jeans, and the braided bun at the crown of her head. It was subtle, the way her lips pressed together, the way her brows creased, as if she were deciding whether or not Kayla was worth the trouble. "Admissions officers are very busy this time of year," Marjorie said finally, her voice laced with condescension. "Unless you have an appointment, you'll have to just leave it here with the rest." "I understand," Kayla said, keeping her voice even, "but I was hoping someone could at least glance over it, my scores and credentials." A door creaked open, and a tall, balding man in a navy suit stepped into the room. His ID badge read Richard Coleman, Senior Admissions Officer. He was mid-conversation with a well-dressed white student and his father, laughing at something the father said. The student, who couldn't have been more than a year older than Kayla, held a thin folder in his hands. The kind that meant he'd already been accepted. Richard gave the student a firm handshake and a promise, "We're looking forward to having you on campus. You'll be an excellent addition to the program." Then, as the student and his father walked out, Richard turned to Marjorie. "Who's next?" Marjorie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at Kayla, then at Richard, then back at Kayla, almost as if she was weighing whether to speak at all. Kayla didn't wait. "I was hoping I could speak with someone about my application," she said, stepping forward. Richard barely acknowledged her before waving a dismissive hand. "Just leave it with the front desk," he said. "If it meets the requirements, it'll be reviewed." "It more than meets the requirements," Kayla countered. "I just—" "Lady," Richard interrupted, already turning back toward his office. "We receive thousands of applications. If we sat down with every student who wanted a personal conversation, we'd never get through them all." Kayla opened her mouth, then closed it. He hadn't even looked at her file. Marjorie's gaze flickered with something almost apologetic, but she said nothing. Kayla wasn't the type to shrink away, but at that moment, standing in the heart of a university that prided itself on diversity and inclusion, it was clear to her that neither mattered here. Not to them. Her fingers curled tighter around the folder. She had options, better options. This wasn't the only school that wanted her. But this? Being brushed off without a second glance? It wasn't just an insult, it was a warning. She had seen this play out before. Without another word, Kayla placed her application on the desk, turned on her heel, and walked out. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that just minutes later, the dean of admissions would walk into the office, and when she saw Kayla's file sitting on that desk, unopened, everything would change. Dr. Vanessa Robinson strode through the admissions office with the kind of presence that made people straighten in their chairs. She wasn't a woman who needed to announce her authority. It followed her like a shadow, unspoken but undeniable. A few students in the waiting area watched her, whispering in hushed tones. Some recognized her from university press releases. others from the panels she spoke on about higher education and racial equity, but none of that mattered to her right now. She was on a mission. Marjorie looked up from her desk, her fingers pausing mid-type. "Good afternoon, Dr. Robinson." "I wasn't expecting—" "I need a few files." Vanessa cut in smoothly, already reaching for the stack on the desk. "Has anything promising come in today?" Marjorie hesitated for just a beat before answering. A few applications were dropped off earlier, but nothing urgent. Vanessa's eyes scanned the pile. Her hand stopped on a manila folder, one that sat near the top. Neat handwriting spelled out a name she didn't recognize. Kayla Taylor. She flipped it open, and what she saw made her breath catch. Perfect SAT scores, a 4.8 GPA, full AP and honors course load, leadership positions, community service, a personal essay that, with just a few opening lines, gripped her like a novel she wouldn't be able to put down. Vanessa looked up sharply. "Who accepted this?" Marjorie blinked. No one yet. She just dropped it off this morning." "Who spoke to her?" At this, Marjorie's posture stiffened, her gaze flicking, just for a fraction of a second, toward the admissions offices. Vanessa caught it. She followed her gaze. "Who spoke to her?" Marjorie swallowed. "Mr. Coleman," she admitted quietly. Vanessa's fingers curled around the folder, pressing into the edges. "And what exactly did Mr. Coleman say?" Marjorie's lips parted, as if she wanted to soften it, to make it sound less damning, but she must have realized there was no point in lying. "He told her to leave it at the desk." Vanessa exhaled sharply through her nose. She turned without another word, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she marched toward Richard Coleman's office. She didn't knock. The door swung open so fast that Richard flinched, looking up from his computer with wide eyes. "Dr. Robinson," he said, his tone a poor attempt at casual. "I wasn't expecting you." Vanessa stepped inside, holding up Kayla's file. "Did you see this?" Richard glanced at it briefly. Did you see this?" she repeated, sharper this time. A pause. Then, finally, a reluctant shake of his head. Vanessa let the silence hang, thick and heavy. "Tell me, Richard," she said, voice dangerously even, "how does an admissions officer look at a student with a perfect academic record and decide, without so much as a glance, that she isn't worth consideration?" Richard shifted in his seat. "We get thousands of applicants. We can't—" "Don't insult me." That shut him up. Vanessa took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing the file on his desk. "This isn't just any application. This is one of the strongest I've ever seen. And you dismissed her." Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "We can't accept everyone who walks through the door." "She didn't just walk through the door," Vanessa shot back. "She earned her place here, and you threw it away without a second thought." Richard's jaw clenched, his irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. "I don't see what the big deal is. If she's that exceptional, she'll get into other schools." Vanessa's nostrils flared. "She already has." That made him pause. "Every Ivy League institution," Vanessa continued, her voice like a blade. "Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. Every single one has already extended an offer, and yet, when she stepped foot in this office, she was treated like she didn't belong here." Richard had the nerve to roll his eyes. "So what's the problem? Clearly she has options." Vanessa's hands pressed against his desk as she leaned forward, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "The problem, Richard, is that this university could have been her first choice. This could have been the place where she thrived, where she led, where she brought prestige and brilliance to our name. But instead, thanks to you, we almost lost one of the most exceptional candidates we've ever seen, because you didn't even look at her." Richard's face darkened. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Vanessa straightened, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into the file and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "A scholarship award." She grabbed a pen from his desk, clicked it, and signed the bottom with a firm, unwavering stroke. "Effective immediately," she said, sliding it back in. "Kayla Taylor is not only admitted, she's receiving a full-ride scholarship." Richard's mouth opened, then shut. "Dr. Consider this your warning, Richard," Vanessa said, turning to the door. "If I ever hear about something like this happening again under your watch." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Richard sat in stunned silence as she walked out, Kayla's acceptance letter now official in her hands. But Vanessa wasn't done, because there was still one more person who needed to hear this news. Dr. Vanessa Robinson sat in her office, staring at the open file on her desk. The name Kayla Taylor was printed neatly across the top, and beneath it, scores, accolades, achievements that would have made any admissions board scramble to secure her. And yet, she had been dismissed. Vanessa exhaled sharply, her fingers pressing into the desk. The weight of the situation sat heavy in her chest. It wasn't just about Kayla. It was about every student like her who had been underestimated, overlooked, pushed aside before anyone even bothered to see them. The phone in her office rang, breaking the silence. She reached for it, pressing the speaker button. "Dr. Robinson?" came the voice of her assistant, Lauren. "I have a Mr. Taylor on the line. He's calling about his daughter's admissions status." Vanessa sat up straighter. She had been expecting this call. "Put him through." A small beep, then a deep male voice filled the room. "Hello, this is Christopher Taylor. I'm calling about my daughter, Kayla. She submitted her application in person this morning, but she hasn't received any updates. We've gotten offers from several universities, but this school was one of her top choices." Vanessa closed her eyes for a brief second before responding. "Mr. Taylor, thank you for calling. First, let me say this. I've personally reviewed your daughter's file, and her application is nothing short of extraordinary." There was a pause on the other end. "Then why was she dismissed?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Vanessa's grip on the desk tightened. "She shouldn't have been. That was a grave mistake. And I want to make it right." Another pause. This time, when Christopher spoke, his voice was laced with quiet frustration. "This isn't the first time my daughter's been overlooked despite her accomplishments, Dr. Robinson. But I won't let it slide again." Vanessa nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "And you shouldn't. I want to assure you I'm handling this personally. I'd like to speak with Kayla directly. Would she be available?" "She's home now," Christopher said. "I'll get her." A faint shuffle, muffled voices, then a new voice came through the line. Clear, steady, but carrying the weight of disappointment. "This is Kayla?" "Kayla," Vanessa said, leaning forward. "I wanted to call you personally because I need you to hear this from me. You were dismissed today, by mistake. One that I deeply regret." A beat of silence. Then, carefully, Kayla asked, "Did he even look at my application?" Vanessa clenched her jaw before forcing her voice to remain level. "No, he didn't." Kayla's exhale was barely audible. "I thought so. That's why I wanted to call, because I did look at it. And Kayla, I need you to know, you are exactly the kind of student this university should be fighting for." There was another pause, this one heavier. "It didn't feel like it," Kayla admitted quietly. "I know," Vanessa said, her voice softer. "And that's why I'm calling. I've already taken action to ensure what happened to you never happens to another student again. And more importantly, if you're still interested, I'd like to personally offer you admission." She heard a sharp intake of breath. Then Kayla spoke, cautiously, as if not quite believing it. "To full ride?" Vanessa smiled. "With a full ride." A pause, then a slight laugh. Small, disbelieved. "So let me get this straight," Kayla said. "One of your admissions officers dismissed me without even glancing at my file, but now you're offering me a full scholarship?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Because that's what you deserve." Kayla was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a voice steadier than before, she asked, "Would this have happened if I hadn't fought for it?" Vanessa felt her chest tighten. She didn't sugarcoat her answer. Probably not. Kayla let out a slow exhale. That's what I thought. Vanessa sat back in her chair. Kayla, listen to me. You have every right to be angry. You shouldn't have to prove yourself over and over just to be taken seriously. But what I don't want is for that man's ignorance to take something away from you. I want you here. I want you in a place where you can thrive, where you can be part of the next generation of leaders that change the system from the inside. Silence on the other end. Then, finally, Kayla spoke, her voice filled with something new, something closer to determination than anger. I'll think about it. Vanessa smiled, sensing that the answer was already forming in Kayla's mind. That's all I ask. As the call ended, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This was bigger than one student, one mistake. This was about changing the way things were done. And Kayla Taylor? She was exactly the kind of student who could help do it. Kayla sat at the kitchen table, her fingers drumming lightly against the wood as she stared at the acceptance letters spread in front of her. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia. Schools that had been nothing more than distant dreams just a few years ago now had her name printed across their official letterheads. Her mother, Cynthia, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken and rice, occasionally glancing over her shoulder at her daughter. You've been staring at those for a while, she said, her voice warm with pride. Still trying to decide? Kayla sighed, leaning back in her chair. It should be easy, right? Pick the best school, pack my bags, and go. And yet, Kayla exhaled, rubbing her temples. It's just, I worked so hard for this. I should be happy, but instead I keep thinking about how that man looked at me, how he dismissed me before I even had the chance to speak. Cynthia turned down the burner and wiped her hands on a dish towel before taking the seat across from her daughter. Baby, people like that have been around forever, and they'll keep showing up, but you don't let them define you. You've already won. Kayla smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I guess. The knock at the door made them both turn. Cynthia raised a brow. Expecting someone? Kayla shook her head and stood, making her way to the door. When she opened it, her stomach dropped. Dr. Vanessa Robinson stood on their porch, holding an envelope with the university's logo on it. She looked as poised as ever, her suit crisp, her posture strong. But her eyes held something softer, something warmer than the first time Kayla had seen her. Miss Taylor, Vanessa greeted. I hope I'm not interrupting. Kayla blinked. No, not at all. Cynthia appeared in the doorway behind her daughter, immediately straightening at the sight of the woman. Good evening, she said politely. Good evening, ma'am. Vanessa smiled before turning her attention back to Kayla. May I come in for a moment? Of course, Cynthia answered before Kayla could, stepping aside to let the woman in. Vanessa took in the modest but warm home, the smell of dinner filling the air. She gestured to the table. May I sit? Kayla nodded hesitantly, taking her own seat across from her. Vanessa set the envelope on the table. I came here because I needed to speak to you face to face, to tell you that what happened in that admissions office should have never happened, and I'm deeply sorry that it did. Kayla's throat tightened. She hadn't expected an apology. She certainly hadn't expected the dean of admissions to show up at her house personally to deliver one. I want you to know that the person responsible for dismissing you without consideration is no longer with the university, Vanessa continued, her voice measured. And I want you to understand that you were never the problem. The problem was a system that allowed people like him to sit in judgment of students they never even bothered to know. Cynthia placed a hand on Kayla's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Vanessa exhaled softly. I know you have other options. Some of the best schools in the country are fighting to have you. But I didn't want you to walk away from us thinking that this institution didn't see your worth, because we do. She slid the envelope forward. Kayla hesitated before picking it up. She opened the flap and pulled out a letter. Full scholarship offer, Presidential Honors Program. Kayla's eyes widened as she read through the words. Tuition, housing, books, everything covered? She looked up, stunned. You're offering me a full ride? Vanessa smiled. Not offering, granting, because you deserve it. Kayla felt her chest tighten. She had spent years proving herself, making sure that every number, every accolade, every accomplishment was undeniable. And yet, in that office, she had been made to feel small, invisible. But now she was being seen. Her mother wiped at her eyes before clearing her throat. This is incredible, Cynthia murmured. Thank you. Vanessa nodded. I want you at our university, Kayla, not just because of your achievements, but because students like you change institutions from the inside. We need you just as much as you need us. Kayla stared down at the letter, her emotions tangled. She had spent so much time imagining herself somewhere else, at a school where she wouldn't have to prove she belonged. But the truth was, this school needed her. She looked up at Vanessa. I'll think about it, she said, a smile playing at her lips. Vanessa chuckled. That's all I can ask. She stood, smoothing out her jacket. Regardless of your decision, I just wanted you to know that we see you, Kayla, and we will always fight for students like you. Kayla stood as well, holding the letter tightly. Thank you for everything. Vanessa nodded, offering one last knowing smile before making her way to the door. As it shut behind her, Kayla sat back down, staring at the letter in her hands. Cynthia exhaled, her voice warm with pride. Looks like the decision just got harder, huh? Kayla grinned. Yeah, but for the first time, it feels like the right kind of hard. She glanced at the other acceptance letters on the table. They were impressive, prestigious, but for the first time since getting them, they didn't feel like the only options. Because for the first time, she had been fought for. And that meant everything.